Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of House of Cards, Season 1 through 3. So, I just watched Seasons 2 and 3 of House of Cards for the first time, back to back, so I thought I'd give a review for the entire run of the series thus far. I'll start out my review spoiler-free, so if you haven't seen any House of Cards yet, not to worry, I won't spoil anything for you, and it might give you an inkling on what to expect. However, at one stage I'm going to want to go into more detail, so I'll have a spoiler section, so if you haven't seen it, you might want to turn that video off then. So the thing about House of Cards that I find interesting is that it's about a Democratic politician in Washington working his way up the food chain. But the thing is, actual policies and political positions are basically irrelevant to the story, as they are irrelevant to the main character and are just a means to an end in order to gain more power. In fact, most of the politicians in the show basically are that same way, but most definitely Kevin Spacey's character Frank Underwood. There's a few reoccurring characters he runs into from time to time that are obviously have strong political convictions and believe in the policies they want to pass, be they Democrat or Republican, but the majority of characters in either party on the show pretty much just use an excuse to gain money or power, even if they claim otherwise. And frankly, from all I've heard about politics, I think this is a very accurate description of the American political system. So I'm afraid I have to say the show might actually unintentionally promote voter apathy, because here it shows you how corrupt and twisted politicians are and how little they care about what their constituents actually want. But in that way, I feel it's an accurate depiction of politics. But unlike other political shows like West Wing or Newsroom, it doesn't promote one political side or another, nor make any statements about particular issues, other than the moral fiber and corrupt nature of politicians in general. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I don't consider it to be a cop-out to remain more neutral as not to alienate half of the U.S. population, mainly because I find the statements on the nature of how corrupt and messed up the political system is good enough. It's kind of similar to some political satires I've seen on shows like South Park or The Simpsons, where the moral is it doesn't matter which side you vote for, both parties are corrupt, which is why I said I think the show promotes voter apathy. However, I do believe that there are differences in the parties, and both parties aren't exactly the same. The nature of the country's policies will differ depending on who's in power, but I feel ultimately it doesn't matter even though the parties are different, because the very nature of the political process is broken and corrupt, and that's what this show illustrates. However, in order to be entertaining, it has to be a tad unrealistic. President Clinton once joked that 99% of the show is accurate, except you could never get an education bill passed that fast. Which is a joke, because the show features like murder, conspiracies, and other things that probably aren't very realistic descriptions of reality. But the point of the joke was government moves a lot slower and is less exciting than what is depicted on the show. Barack Obama also joked that he wished that real government was as ruthlessly efficient as in House of Cards. As for the story itself, I was first attracted to House of Cards because Kevin Spacey is the star, and he is, frankly, in my opinion, one of the best, if not best, actors who ever lived. So when I found out he was in the show, I had to watch it. I also heard that David Fincher was involved, even directing a few episodes, and he's one of my favorite directors. So the question of did it live up to my expectations, the answer, I'm afraid, would have to be no. And I'm afraid to have to say this, but my belief is that Kevin Spacey is too good for this show and should not be in it, and rather be off making excellent movies. But I guess maybe this is a sign his career isn't what it used to be. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a bad show. It's extremely well made and moderately engaging show. I just don't think it has the caliber that the names of Kevin Spacey and David Fincher would imply. It's based off a British TV series that ran in the early 90s of the same name, and once I learned that, it made perfect sense, and I was surprised I didn't even guess that on my own, because There are times when Kevin Spacey's Frank Underwood will have little asides to the camera and talk directly to the audience about his motivations and what he's thinking, and sometimes explain the situation, and this so feels like a British device to me. I know it has origins in like Shakespearean era plays where the main character would often have asides to the audience, but a film and TV, it seems that it's usually only employed in British works, not really American works. That being said, I really like this device, and I think it adds to the story. I also like how the main focus on the series, Frank Underwood is an anti-hero, someone you find yourself rooting for, but is actually a very bad person and has done some horrible things. So I do think this show has its strong points. However, I do think it moves a tad bit too slowly at times, but when it gets going, it can be really good. So before I get into my spoiler section, I'll give my rating for the first 3 seasons of House of Cards as a whole, and I give it an 8, extremely good. Is it worth watching? Most definitely. Is it a masterpiece? Not quite. There are some amazing performances and engaging and tense plot lines, but overall, nothing mind-blowing or amazing, and at times it could be a bit boring or cliched. So if you haven't seen the show yet, you should probably stop here. Be sure to check out my channel, and thanks for watching. But if you have seen the first 3 seasons of House of Cards, please continue onward as I go into more detail. So first off, I'll start off with Season 1, and I'll be honest, I haven't seen Season 1 since over a year ago, so I'm a bit fuzzy on the details. But what I do remember is not being overly impressed with the first set of episodes. In fact, I would describe Season 1 as having a real slow start, but towards the end of the season, once everything gets going, it really gets exciting. In fact, I would say the last set of episodes in Season 1 were probably the best of the entire series. I really liked the storyline with Zoe Barnes and the whole newspaper crew. It added an interesting dynamic that was lacking in later seasons. The affair she had with Frank Underwood was interesting as well. The way they were using each other, and at first was a hot fling, and later it felt to Zoe like an obligation. I also found it interesting how Claire and Frank were both having affairs with separate people, and although it did create some tension there, it was ultimately an understanding between them that they have affairs, and their marriage was more of a political alliance more than anything else. Also, the storyline with Peter Rousseau was also very intriguing, although, again, it took a while to get started, but once it did, it added an interesting dynamic to the show, and the way it ended with Frank basically killing him was awesome television. I felt it really worked for the show. So my rating for Season 1 is a 7. Very good. This is a good setup for the series that really defined Frank Underwood's character and showed how he rolled and how he'd do anything to come out on top. He definitely comes off as a manipulative mastermind, and that was entertaining to watch. But as I said, the story took far too long to get going, and many of the scenes I felt were irrelevant to the overall story. So next was Season 2, which for me was more consistently entertaining and didn't take as long to get going. However, it's not without its flaws. The thing that bothered me the most was that what they did with Zoe Barnes and the whole newspaper storyline. I have no idea why they wrote her off the show, but if I were to guess, I would say the actress who played her quit. At least I'm left with that impression, as her death seemed a bit sudden and sloppy and never really had any further implications down the road. It seemed to me like they just wanted to write off the show right away, so they just scrambled to do it at the last second, and what they came up with wasn't really that good or connected to the overall story. And then there's what they did with Lucas trying to avenge her death and expose Underwood as a murderer. Underwood dismissed him as an inconvenience that was easy to squash, and you know what? He was right. And that made for really flat and anticlimactic storytelling. They kept this story going for a while, making me think they were going somewhere with this, but ultimately they didn't, which made me think the whole thing was a waste of time. And ultimately they wrote off the whole newspaper storyline, which I felt was a very interesting aspect of Season 1. I suppose the only purpose that storyline did serve was to introduce us to the character of Gavin Orsay, the hacker, And ultimately, I didn't really quite like that storyline, and I found it more of a distraction. However, the highlight of this season, which is what made it really great to me, was the conflict between Frank Underwood and the businessman Raymond Tusk. Tusk was first introduced in season 1 and seemed more like a periphery character, so I liked how they slowly built up to the storyline. It started out with Frank noticing that Tusk held a lot of sway over the president, and Frank wanted to be the only one, or at least the main one, with the president's ear, so he conspired to sabotage Tusk's relationship with the president, and he ended up finding out that he bit off more than he could chew, as it started an out-and-out war with Raymond Tusk, who was just as capable of playing dirty as Underwood was. I really liked the storyline for several reasons. First of all, it was exciting to see Frank Underwood meet his match and go up against someone as devious as he is, but someone with much more power. And secondly, I liked how it was portrayed how much power and influence a big business has over government in modern day society. If anything, I think that they underplayed how much influence they have. It was great that Frank was so overwhelmed that in order to win, he had to play a wild card that could end up harming him and destroying his own career, or even possibly putting him in prison. So he had to take a huge risk rather than face defeat. And he himself, had told Claire that he was in danger of losing. And he managed to scrape by the skin of his teeth, not only defeating Tusk, but elevating himself to president. And that's the power of having a show about an anti-hero, because this is a guy who murders people and does all sorts of shady things, but you're actually rooting for him to win and practically cheer when he does. Another thing I liked about this season was how Claire wasn't as prominent a character as she was in season 1 or 3, because I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this character. I think she does have an important part to play, and her function as Frank's other half, who's just as cold and calculating, really works, but that's why I liked her better in this season, because she's mostly served that function of being Frank's partner in crime, and she played that function very well. Whereas in season 1, the storyline with her running a charity and having a battle of wits with one of her employees, I found rather boring and a distraction. So unlike the newspaper storyline, I was glad that they swept that under the rug and got rid of it in the very first episode this season. However, I wasn't too pleased about what they did with Freddy this season, and by making him more important, but then taking away his Ribs' place. I thought he worked much better as a periphery character, and I just hated that he lost his restaurant. But I really liked the introduction of Jackie Sharp, and I liked the relationship she had with Remy, and how that became stretched when things got heated between his boss Raymond Tusk and her political ally Frank Underwood. That added a nice dynamic to the story. So my rating for season 2 is an 8, extremely good. A good, intense season that did a lot of things right, but it's not without its flaws, as it did some things wrong as well. Plus, I found the final episode to be not quite as satisfying nor rewarding as I hoped it would be. So next is season 3, and I have to be honest, this is where the show loses me. And if season 3 is any indication of what season 4 will be like, I'm not sure I want to keep watching the show. Don't get me wrong, I didn't totally hate season 3. It did have its good parts, but ultimately I think it had a lot of wasted potential. It set up a lot of interesting storylines, but to me it didn't pay them off in an interesting or satisfying way. The main problem I had with season 3 is that Frank Underwood did not come off as smart, ruthless, or as efficient this season. First off, it starts with a disconnect, where at the end of season 2, where you see him as president, he's kicking ass and taking names, which is what you'd expect from Frank Underwood. But season 3 begins where his presidency is in a slump, his approval ratings are way down, no one in Congress wants to work with him, and of course that's completely changing things from the end of season 2, but at first I thought, well, that's alright, because I know they have to create tension and obstacles for Frank to overcome. The problem is that he never really does overcome them this season, and all in all, he's not a very efficient politician as he was in the first 2 seasons. He constantly gets his ass handed to him, and he makes blatantly dumb decisions, such as alienating Jackie Sharp by humiliating her at the debate, and then treating her like shit when she complained about it. Yes, we know Frank is power hungry and egotistical, but he's also smart and knows how to manipulate people. And in terms of manipulation, this was a really dumbass move that he should have been smart enough to see would simply push Jackie to the opposition. Also, this season focused way too much on his relationship with Claire. As I said, I believe Claire worked better as a periphery character, and they decided to make her front and center this season. And I do think it worked sometimes, as in the case with the episode of her trying to talk the gay activists into capitulating to the Russian president's terms. But overall, I got a bit sick of her, and I also really didn't like the storyline with the author who was writing a book about Frank. I mean, at first it was okay, but it got more boring and ridiculous as the season went on, and finally ending with this ridiculous storyline about him changing his book to be all about Frank and Claire, which got him fired and became obsessed with publishing it. To me, that completely ruined his character, and it felt really out of place. And then we have Doug Stamper. His storyline has he had a lot more screen time this season, which for the most part moved way too slow and was the most boring storyline in the entire season, which leads me to the final episode of the season, which I absolutely hated. And I felt it was the worst episode of the entire series, as it pretty much destroyed any positive ground this season has made. First off, it completely sidetracked the Frank running against Dunbar storyline in favor of a ridiculous storyline of Claire wanting to leave Frank. I was absolutely hated this storyline. First of all, who really cares if Claire leaves Frank? That's not really what this show is about. Secondly, this felt really disconnected and out of the blue with everything else. I know in real life people can leave people out of the blue like this, but what works in real life doesn't always translate for a story. And in this story, it felt completely out of place, and I simply was not buying it. It took me out of the story because it was obvious that the writers just made this up in order to create tension in their marriage and make Claire more prominent of a character, and I hated it. This is a totally different show. This isn't the same show I've been watching for 2 seasons, and it's not one I'd particularly care to watch. And the other storyline, what we got this episode, is with Doug finding Rachel and killing her, which I also totally hated. This storyline didn't make any sense to me either, because we saw he got so depressed and started drinking again when he thought that Rachel was dead. So that said to me that he was in love with her. So why then, once he finds out she's still alive, the first thing he wants to do is kill her? That makes absolutely no sense to me. So he was depressed about her death because he wanted to be the one to kill her? I'm sorry, but that's fucking stupid. Also, it was so fucking despicable. I mean, worse than Frank killing Zoe Barnes, because at least, that had political motivation to it. He had to kill her in order to save himself, whereas Doug was doing it just for flat-out revenge, as she proved she wasn't a threat. Plus, the way that they dragged it out in this episode made me think it might actually go somewhere and have some importance, but nope, he just kills her anyway, and for no good reason. And plus, this season had done such a great job of getting me to sympathize with Doug's character, and to see where he went through that, all he went through in that journey, only to just throw it all away in one pointless episode that now makes me despise this character more than anything. The only way Season 4 can redeem itself in my eyes is to turn around next season and Claire instantly change her mind and decides to go back to Frank, and they pretend that whole thing never happened. We never see that stupid writer guy again, and if Doug is killed in the most violent and horrible way. Either that, or he gets arrested for killing Rachel and is put away for life, or maybe even a death penalty. That's the only thing. They have to get rid of Doug now. can't stand that guy now. And Frank Underwood starts being the mastermind manipulator he was in the first 2 seasons and not the egotistical dumbass he was in this season. However, season 3 wasn't all bad. There were great moments, great episodes, such as episodes with the Russian president. They were all very interesting, and Frank's struggle with trying to promote America Works and the competition he had with Dunbar and the Democratic leadership telling him not to run. These were all great, exciting storylines, but they just dropped the ball on most of them at the end. So my rating for season 3 was a 4 poor. Some great moments, great storylines, but they were ruined by a horrible ending and changing focus to Claire and Frank's relationship and changing the nature of Frank's character to make him less effective. So that's it for my review of House of Cards. Be sure to check out my channel for other TV show reviews such as Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, Lost, and several others. And be sure to subscribe to keep up with future videos I'll be doing. And thanks a lot for watching.